If you stop right now and turn on the tap, well, you probably expect clean, safe water to come out. It's fundamental to modern life, isn't it?
It really is. But, for roughly 20% of the world's 7 billion people, that expectation is completely non-existent.
20%, that's staggering.
It is. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people lacking easy access to water for just basic survival, let alone economic needs.
And this isn't just an inconvenience, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's a staggering human cost. This lack of access creates these intense burdens of immense labor, constant uncertainty, profound insecurity about your livelihood.
Yeah.
And every source we looked at for this deep dive, they all agree. These costs fall heaviest on the most marginalized. We see it disproportionately hitting women, children, the elderly, particularly in the global south.
Now, historically, when you hear policymakers talk about this, the frame is usually scarcity, isn't it? Climate change, not enough rain, dried up rivers, that kind of thing.
That's the dominant narrative, yes. We see it everywhere.
Yeah. But the research we're digging into today, it comes from a synthesis driven by a really influential National Science Foundation workshop at UC Santa Cruz. It makes a pretty radical counterargument.
It does. They argue that while, yes, natural shortages are absolutely real, the crisis we're seeing now, it's overwhelmingly socially produced.
Socially produced. Okay, unpack that a bit.
That's the absolute core insight, and it really shifts the entire conversation. It means the crisis results less from nature's limits and more from, human decisions. Choices made, or sometimes not made, that deliberately or even accidentally create this really uneven distribution of water, of resources, of benefits.
So the central issue isn't just, say, hydrogeology.
Exactly. It's governance. How are decisions about water actually made? Who gets to make them? And ultimately, who benefits? That's what we need to explore.
Right. So our mission today is to use this framework, developed by these experts, to move beyond just counting liters of water. We want to understand this complex system of injustice, who decides where pipes go, who gets water first, and how those decisions create or deepen inequality across so many different scales. Okay, let's start with maybe the hard truth. Why hasn't traditional research really cracked this problem yet? The experts identified some pretty significant analytical blind spots.
Yeah, that's a key starting point.
And the first major hurdle they hit is what they call the problem of scale.
Right. Think about it this way. Traditional water research is often quite limited in its focus. A study might look intensely at a single village's well, or maybe just one giant dam project, or perhaps the water policies within just one country.
But water doesn't work like that, does it?
Exactly. It doesn't respect those neat boundaries we draw. It's fluid.
So if you're only looking at that one village,
you completely miss the influence of, say, the massive regional dam built 100 miles upstream, or the transnational trade agreement dictating what crops get grown, which uses huge amounts of water.
Or even how long it takes for an aquifer to deplete. Generations, maybe.
Precisely. Water crosses ecological scales, social scales, spatial, temporal dimensions, constantly. And a single-scale focus just fails to capture that crucial interconnectedness. It's like looking at one piece of a puzzle.
And then it gets even more complicated, I suppose, when you layer on this problem of disciplinary bias.
Yes, definitely. Say you're an economist, right? You're studying water pricing. Or you're an anthropologist looking at community water practices. Or maybe a political scientist tracking policy debates.
They all have their own lens.
They all come with a very specific, sometimes narrow lens. Their vision is limited by the characteristic methods, the usual questions, the typical scope of their own specialization.
So the anthropologist might miss the physical reality of the water source.
If they don't talk to the hydrologist. And the hydrologist might miss the power dynamics shaping who gets the water.
If they don't talk to the political scientist.
Right.
Makes sense.
You see the problem. It's fragmentation.
So the goal then of this Santa Cruz workshop and the research that came out of it was to try and overcome that, to build a framework that's explicitly integrative.
Exactly. Integrative, multi-scalar, and genuinely cross-disciplinary. It needs to account for all the ways inequity shows up, from how water is physically used, all the way to who actually gets a seat at the table in decision-making.
Okay, so this shift in perspective, it really requires challenging the basic definition of equity, doesn't it? When you look at a lot of the academic literature or development goals, like the UN Millennium Development Goals, water inequities are almost always framed just in terms of quantity and quality. Basically, how much water do you get and is it clean?
And look, those are absolutely non-negotiable foundations. Clean water, enough water essential. But that narrow focus alone, it's just not sufficient to solve the justice problem.
Why not? What does it miss?
Well, for one, it completely fails to address really thorny issues like fair allocation between competing users. Think about allocating water between a huge multinational bottling plant versus local farmers trying to grow food to survive. Quantity and quality metrics don't help you there.
Right. And it also doesn't capture things like the impact of global forces,
Right.
like climate change, making local supply less reliable.
Precisely. The certainty aspect, the reliability, it misses that, which is why we have to widen the metrics we use.
And this is where the ideas of Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, come in, through the capabilities approach.
Yes, this is a really huge conceptual leap, actually. Instead of just defining success by the volume delivered, did everyone get their 10 liters of safe water today? We shift the metric
To what?
to freedoms and capabilities. We start asking, fundamentally, how does access to water facilitate the capabilities that allow someone to live a flourishing life in this specific society?
Okay, what's the practical difference? What does that look like on the ground?
Oh, the difference is enormous. It means equity issues become much wider than just having a clean pipe nearby. It forces us to measure things like the sheer labor time spent collecting water,
Hours a day, often for women and girls.
hours that could have been spent in school or earning income. It makes us measure the health outcomes linked to poor water, the opportunities people miss out on because they're spending hours fetching water, the certainty or lack thereof of the supply.
So it reframes it from just delivering a commodity.
Into a human development issue. Exactly. It's about enabling people to do and be things they value.
And thinking about it that way, you realize that accessing water isn't always about owning land or having a formal pipe connection. Which brings us to another key concept, the theory of access, from Ribot and Peluso.
Right. This tackles a really interesting question. Why isn't having formal legal rights like property deeds or official water rights always enough to guarantee someone actually gets water?
Yeah, that seems counterintuitive.
The theory of access allows us to examine how people gain, maintain, or lose access to resources in ways that are not solely dependent on those formal legal rights. It looks beyond the law on paper.
So how does that work? If the law says I own the water rights, how can someone else get access? Or how could I lose it?
Well, it introduces this really important idea of legal pluralism. The reality on the ground is that formal national laws and property deeds often don't fully reflect the actual practices, the norms, the real rules that govern resource use.
You mean there are other systems at play?
Exactly. You often have multiple rights regimes operating at the same time. There's national law, sure, but there's also regional policy, local cultural rules, the authority of maybe village elders or traditional leaders, or even powerful local figures. And inequity often hides in that gap, you see, between the formal legal system and what's actually considered fair or legitimate governance by the local community. The true source of power to access water might be your social connections or your political influence, not just a piece of paper.
Okay, this is getting complex. We've got different scales, competing rights, social dimensions. How do we make sense of all these crossing lines? The workshop experts proposed an overarching framework for this, right? The multi-scalar framework around the hydrosocial cycle.
Yes, that concept is really critical for understanding water today. The traditional hydrological cycle, the one most of us learned in school, it just describes water moving through nature, clouds, rivers, groundwater,
Eaves people out.
completely leaves humans out of the equation. The newer concept, the hydrosocial cycle, finally corrects that. It recognizes that water is actively co-produced by nature and society. It incorporates social uses, political struggles, infrastructure, everything.
Okay, so it puts the human element back in. And the research breaks this down further into 4 main types of hydrosocial cycles.
That's right. They identified 4 predominant cycles, and importantly, each comes with its own characteristic technologies and, crucially, its own inherent inequalities often built right into the system.
Can you walk us through those 4?
Sure. The first is the irrigation cycle. Think large-scale agriculture, driven by technologies like massive canals, diversion dams, deep groundwater pumps.
And the injustice there.
Often it's about flow. Upstream users might take more water than allocated, or they might pollute it with agricultural runoff, directly impacting downstream users who often have very little power to challenge them.
Okay, what's the second cycle?
Second, we have the mining and industry cycle. This often involves very powerful actors, maybe multinational corporations, needing vast amounts of water for extraction or processing.
Pitting them against local communities, I imagine.
Exactly, creating huge imbalances in political influence, resource needs, and often leading to pollution or depletion that harms local users.
Right.
Third. Third is rural household water. This typically involves smaller, often more decentralized technologies. Think community hand pumps, shallow wells, rainwater harvesting.
And the inequity here.
Often stems from things like simple infrastructure neglect, pumps breaking down and not being repaired, or inequitable placement of water points, maybe favoring certain parts of a village over others. Failure to maintain systems serving the poorest.
Okay, and the last one.
And finally, the urban water supply cycle. This is your big city system, huge reservoirs, complex treatment plants, extensive pipe networks.
And the inequality here is the classic story.
Pretty much. Service delivery is often excellent in the wealthy city center, maybe the formerly planned areas, but it becomes patchy, unreliable, maybe exorbitantly expensive through resellers, or completely non-existent in the informal settlements on the periphery.
And what the multiscalar approach really highlights then is that these inequities aren't just stuck within one cycle. They jump across them, right? From the household level right up to the global.
Precisely. Take that mining example again. The local community's water gets polluted. That's a micro-scale impact. But the decision to allow that mining operation, or the lack of regulation, that's tied to national economic policy, which itself is influenced by global markets for those raw materials.
Wow.
So the injustice crosses scales. And the governance, the formal laws, the informal social practices, the enforcement or lack thereof, that's the sort of glue connecting every single hydrosocial cycle and crossing all these different scales.
Let's make this even more concrete. Let's move to some of the case studies discussed in the research, because this is where these abstract frameworks, capabilities, access theory, hydrosocial cycles really come alive.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the staggering gendered burden in the global south.
Yes, it's such a clear example of how these inequities operate. It manifests as both material inequity, the physical burden, and procedural inequity, the lack of voice.
How so?
Well, women are consistently, almost universally in many regions, designated as the primary managers of domestic water. They're responsible for finding it, fetching it, managing it for the household.
Yeah, at the same time, they are very frequently excluded from the formal decision-making forums where choices about water infrastructure, resource allocation, or management rules are made.
So they have all the responsibility, but none of the power.
Essentially, yes. And that procedural exclusion being left out of the decision-making ensures the system often remains stacked against their needs and priorities.
Is there a specific example of how this plays out?
The research highlights a case from Kenya that provides a really painful illustration. When women, or often their daughters, are forced to spend several hours every single day just fetching water.
Yeah.
That time investment is a direct opportunity cost. It physically prevents them from pursuing education, from engaging in income-generating activities, or even from participating in local political life or community meetings.
That's the capabilities approach right there, isn't it? Water access, or lack thereof, directly limiting their freedom to function, to achieve things. Exactly. It limits their capabilities. And that idea of injustice being deeply built into the system, not just accidental, is perfectly captured in another study comparing Dar es Salaam and Nairobi.
What did that show?
It showed that the contemporary water inequalities you see in those cities today aren't random. They aren't just recent failures. They are deeply rooted.
How far back?
Back to the colonial era. The research describes them as many overlapping injustices, rooted directly in the segregation policies of colonial rule. Unjust land allocation patterns established decades ago dictated where infrastructure went first and where it was deliberately withheld.
So the patterns of who gets water today still reflect those colonial decisions.
To a significant extent, yes. The present failures in service delivery often echo that historical geography of exclusion. The colonial past casts a very long shadow.
That connection is startling. Another really fascinating finding you mentioned came from India, specifically about how we even categorize water.
Yes, this one challenges some fundamental assumptions in water management. The experts argue that a major policy failure in parts of India is exacerbated by treating surface water, like rivers and lakes and groundwater, as completely separate resources in policy and law.
But they aren't really separate in nature, are they?
Not at all. They're interconnected hydrologically. Water moves between them. But treating them as separate in policy has real consequences for equity.
Like what?
Well, it turns out that wealthier users, large landowners, industries that can often afford to drill deeper wells and invest in powerful pumps, so they capture a much greater share of the groundwater,
Leaving less for others.
leaving less available for poorer users who rely more on shallower wells or surface water sources, which become less reliable as the groundwater is depleted. The arbitrary policy choice to separate them ignores the physical reality and effectively rewards wealth, making social inequity worse.
So the recommendation from the researchers is pretty radical then. Policy needs to stop treating them as separate.
Essentially, yes. Treat water as existing in multiple interconnected forms and manage it conjunctively, recognizing the links. Drop the arbitrary distinction that benefits the powerful.
It's an example of how a technical issue is actually a governance issue.
Exactly. And finally, just to touch on a positive note, the research also shows that democratization, meaning more equal involvement in decision-making, can lead to tangibly better outcomes. There's a great example from Caracas, Venezuela.
Oh yeah, what happened there?
Well, in some of the poorer neighborhoods, they established what are called mesas técnicas de agua, basically, technical water committees.
Okay.
These committees provide a formal structure and actual opportunity for residents who were usually excluded to come together, to claim their rights, to participate in planning water solutions, and to collectively manage the resource for their own community.
And did it work?
The research suggests it did more than just deliver some physical improvements, like fixing pipes. Critically, it enhanced the residents' political capacity. It showed that when you empower citizens, especially those historically marginalized from governance, the outcomes tend to become more just and more equitable. So if we try to synthesize this whole deep dive, I think the core message coming through from all the research is really clear. The global water crisis. We have to view it first and foremost as a crisis of water justice, not just simply water scarcity.
It's a shift in framing.
A fundamental shift. It demands a much more sophisticated understanding, seeing water as a resource that's co-produced by nature and society. And it requires using something like that multiscalar framework to recognize all the complex, interconnected ways injustice actually operates.
And this whole body of work, this thinking, it culminated in something called the Santa Cruz Declaration on the Global Water Crisis. What was the aim of that?
Well, the declaration really intends to shift global concern away from just simple aid metrics like dollars spent or pipes laid towards focusing on the hundreds of millions of poor people whose full human flourishing, whose capabilities are severely constrained by these water injustices.
So it's trying to change the conversation at a higher level.
Exactly. They want the conversation to expand beyond just ensuring everyone gets X liters of basic water. They're pushing for this idea of deliberate fairness between competing uses.
Like that farmer versus factory example earlier.
Precisely. Should the local farmer have their fields dry up because a distant industry needs massive quantities of water to produce goods for export? That's the kind of complex, deeply political question we need to be asking and debating openly.
And they proposed a key principle for that, didn't they? For equitable allocation.
Yes, the Declaration states it quite powerfully. Water justice can be imagined as equitable or comparable access for particular water uses and deliberated fairness between uses.
Deliberated fairness between uses. That provides a really strong directive, doesn't it? For research, for policy, for action.
It really does. It's the ultimate recognition, I think, that water is inherently political. And the solution lies not just in building new infrastructure, though that's often needed, but in radical governance reform.
Yeah.
In making decision-making fairer.
We hope this deep dive gives you, our listener, a profound new lens to view water through. Not just as, a simple flow of H2O, but as a complex political terrain, a space where justice is constantly being fought for and, sadly, still often denied. So here's something to think about. If the history of colonial rule and past political decisions can still dictate who has clean water access today, what historical injustice might be baked into the other basic infrastructure you rely on every day? Food for thought. We encourage you to keep exploring these social and political dimensions of resources. Thanks for diving in with us.